Russia's African adventure is quietly coming apart at the seams. For years, the Kremlin has been active there through one particular entity, the Wagner Group. The shadow army across the continent, feared, brutal, but always profitable. Yet, after Prigozhin's failed mutiny in 23 and sudden death, Moscow's tried to replace it with a shiny new clone, the so-called Africa Corps. Now, on paper, this new force is more legitimate, more controlled, because it's under the MOD. But in reality, it's actually weaker, overstretched, and already bleeding, if not completely bled, its credibility. The myth of Russia's unstoppable rise in Africa is fading, and very fast. With that in mind, in this video, I wanted to have a deep dive into how Russia's operations in Africa have been in the past few years, but are severely deteriorating. Why Wagner has been swapped out, what the African Corps really looks like, and why Moscow's African project is starting to completely blunder under its own contradictions. Stick around for this one. It's pretty nuts.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where, if you're new here, we focus on the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis on Russia, Ukraine, but in this case, Russia's involvement in the African continent, somewhere I've worked firsthand and have a lot of knowledge about. You see, Russia's involvement in Africa isn't a new thing. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union poured weapons, money, and advisors into liberation movements and post-colonial regimes, Ethiopia, Mozambique, or interestingly, my favourite, Angola, and the 30,000 troops of Cuba that were supported by Soviet money. But when the USSR collapsed, Moscow retreated. Africa became a backwater for Russian foreign policy, purely because Russia didn't have the reach of America, and was overshadowed by Europe, the Middle East, and later China. Now, this began to change after the financial crisis in 2008 and arguably the mid-2010s. As Western influence wobbled, Russia seized these opportunities. But conversely to China, which arrived with roads, rails, investment packages, or what you know as debt diplomacy in some circles, Moscow came with something simpler: guns, mercenaries, and more traditional forms of hard power. And this is where Wagner, in the middle of the 2010s, 2015, you see, emerged at the tip of this spear. But before going further, I ask you, were you aware of Russia's activities in Africa? Do you think they're overblown, or is there some depth to this? Let me know in the comments below. Now, the first rumours of a so-called Wagner Group emerged in 2015 in rather random circumstances in Libya, where notions of a alternative or PMC, private military contractor, were present, fighting on behalf of the what was left of pro-Gaddafi groups against what was known as the TNC, or transnational government, that was backed by the US and UN. But it wasn't until a few years later, for 2018, when Wagner became much more present and confirmed, when it entrenched itself in the Central African Republic, from President then Touadéra, fighting rebels and crucially grabbing mining concessions, a common theme we'll pick up as we go through this video. Now, in Mali, Wagner became the partner of choice after a string of coups pushed out the French in the early 2020s, where they had been present since 2013, fighting Islamic jihadists as part of a coalition of forces, including a UN force, which wrapped up a couple of years ago. To the remnants of what was France's activities in West Africa, they were quickly dispelled by the then Malian government, with a deal being straightforward for the Russians. Wagner's brutality quickly became clear and was also notorious. Human rights groups, the UN, documenting massacres not from just the Islamic jihadists, but Wagner themselves, also extrajudicial killings and torture. But for many rulings elite, Wagner offered what Western troops could not: immediate, no questions asked support, without any lectures of democracy, human rights, or having to be aware of a fairer society for the citizens of Mali. The ongoing coups that occurred across the west of Africa, or otherwise known as the Sahel, meant that optics mattered in Mali and how it spelt across. Protesters waved Russian flags and carried banners saying "Thank you, Wagner" when French troops departed. Russia presented itself as this anti-colonial partner, the liberator from Western arrogance, hypocrisy, and many themes we hear mentioned in pro-Putinist camps. But the uncomfortable truth is this: Wagner achieved tactical victories, yet strategically the security situation plateaued, if anything actually worsened. Jihadists spread further, attacks grew larger and more bold, and civilian casualties only mounted. It's only in the past few months when more information has come to light about the atrocities done in the past year that I've been able to make this long-standing video that I've been meaning to for all these months. In the run-up to the 2023 period, Wagner was most effective. But then June 23 came around. Prigozhin, Wagner's bombastic leader, launched a mutiny against Moscow. 2 months later, he was dead in a plane crash. Suddenly, the Wagner brand was toxic. Moscow needed a replacement, and very quickly, not only for performances based on military terms, but also the optics based on diplomatic ones. So along came what was called Africa Corps. You see, unlike Wagner, the Africa Corps is officially under Russia's Ministry of Defense. It recruits ex-Wagner fighters, but places them alongside elite Russian officers. Even the branding, Africa Corps, sounds more like a Western terminology for a military branch, not something that you'd find disposed from the Kremlin. Moreover, it's Telegram channels, projecting the image of discipline and control, not the rogue mercenary outfit and sense of hysteria or just meme culture that you might see on other accounts of Telegram. But let's be clear, this is, of course, cosmetic. The Africa Corps still provides exactly the same services, regime protection, battlefield support, training, just under this new branding. And the real purpose is to give Moscow an even greater degree of plausible deniability and a fresh start. Putin distancing himself from those darker days of Prigozhin's pushback and what seemed like a real scare for the Kremlin at the time. If you notice a change in scenery here, well, that's because I was recording this video the day before, but it got so dark I couldn't actually see the camera. So here we are, and the change in wardrobe. But back to the video. Now, all of this, Mali has been ground zero for Russia's Africa experiment. Around 2,000 Russian fighters are present, but far fewer than the 5,000 troops that were once deployed across the Sahel, or the 12,000 UN peacekeepers who left after the events occurred in 2023. The optics worked. The junta in Mali, led by Assimi Goïta, paraded early wins like the recapture of Kidal and even staged the symbolic return of Timbuktu's manuscripts in 24 as proof that Wagner had restored security. The reality was far bleaker. Deaths linked to jihads had averaged over 3,000 per year since 22, compared to under 800 in the previous decade when the French led their coalition force. Nearly 2,000 people had already been killed this year alone, and the jihadist network known as GNIM was expanding into new hubs like Cannes and major trade arteries towards the much more stable but regionally significant Senegal. Wagner's methods, including massacre, blockades, open-air prisons, alienated Malians. And in the past year, 80% of civilian deaths, non-combatants, have been caused by jihadists. No, by Wagner and the Malian soldiers themselves. Informants dried up, communities radicalized, and separatists are now joining the jihadists in a broad coalition against both Bamako and Moscow. Tensions inside Mali's army are also exploding. Dozens of generals were purged in August of this year for criticizing Wagner's brutality. Soldiers complain the Russians treat them with racism, seize equipment, and demand evacuation priorities. And as one official has put it, they've gone from the frying pan into the fire. Wagner's economic footprint is terrible as well. Unlike in the Central African Republic, Mali's junta has resisted handing over its major gold mines. Attempts to seize artisanal mining have failed. And increasingly, Moscow is footing the bill directly, a costly drain for a sanctions-strangled war economy that's already having to sell off its own gold reserves. Public support has collapsed too. Where once Wagner flags, Russian flags filled Bamako streets, ordinary Malians now grumble that Russia has lost 80% of its popularity. Disappointment is deepening, and rumours splits inside the junta government point to possible coups ahead. There is even talk of a desire for the yesteryear of Western intervention instead. Shifting eastwards, and you look at the Central African Republic, or CAR, where Wagner's oldest and deepest foothold is. When French troops left in 2022, Wagner became indispensable. But now Moscow is asking CAR to swap Wagner for the Africa Corps, and crucially, to pay for it. This is a sign of Russia's financial strain. You see, during Wagner's heyday, mercenaries were rewarded with these mining concessions. But with Russia's war economy desperate for cash, Moscow prefers hard currency. For CAR, it's one of the poorest countries on earth. This is a heavy burden, and not one it can do. Nearly 70% of its people live in extreme poverty, less than $1 a day. Yet its government is somehow expected to bankroll Russian forces. Opposition figures openly criticize the secrecy around these payments. But the president has little choice, and without Russian protection, his presidency might collapse, and therefore it becomes a case of vested interest. In between Mali and CAR are Burkina Faso and Niger. Now, Russia's footprint is smaller here, a few hundred African core fighters, but its propaganda presence is massive and arguably most effective. Russian flags fly at rallies, telegram channels pump out anti-French, anti-Western narratives, and local juntas embrace Moscow as some part of convenience and liberation. But again, the results and numbers are grim. In Burkina Faso, more than 15,000 people have been killed since Captain Ibrahim Traore's pro-Russian coup in 2022, worse than under any French counterterrorism operation. Conversely, Niger faces the same dilemma. Russian support has symbolic value, but jihadist groups are closing in on the capital, Niamey. The image of strength is belied by the reality of insecurity and Moscow's inability to project power as far as China or America can. Now, Russia's Africa strategy isn't purely or even largely about soldiers and guns. It's about, of course, disinformation. The Kremlin unleashes armies of bot farms, troll networks, and paid influencers across Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram. Some of the biggest pro-Russian accounts on X, for example, actually are people who exist or come from Nigeria. Their narratives are simple. The West is exploitative. Russia is a friend, and sovereignty means rejection of Paris, Washington, Brussels. For many Africans, these messages resonate. Memories of colonialism remain raw, especially around France's failures in the Sahel, or its war against Algeria, or its sort of neo-colonialism through economic means in the subsequent years. France's failures have built resentment, and Russia therefore steps in as the no-paperwork partner. Weapons arrive faster, fewer strings attached, sort of similar to China's Belt Road Initiative versus the World Bank. But this is short-term appeal, which masks long-term fragility. Russia offers mercenaries and memes, not real development or real security. Not that the West has done a better job, mind you. It's about an illusion of strength, because those critical of Russia in Africa offer an example of a Bond-styled villain, always 2 steps ahead, pulling invisible strings, but it gives Moscow too much credit. Look at the numbers. These casual numbers in Mali, the few hundred in Burkina Faso and Niger, across a continent of 1.4 billion people, these are tiny deployments versus, say, America's 30,000 troops in Qatar. Not that you should necessarily agree with that either. Russia unquestionably dominates information space, but militarily it is overstretched. Every new ambush, every civilian massacre chips away at its credibility, and African elites see these cracks. Moreover, it undermines Russia's ability to diversify its own resources. The sanctions bite, the war in Ukraine drags on, and Moscow has to increasingly consider where it projects its power. Disinformation campaigns are relatively cheap, but if you don't have physical manpower to back up those claims of security provision, they don't go anywhere. So in all this, what does Moscow do? What does it really want? At the one level, Africa offers resources, gold, diamonds, timber, that help Russia bypass the sanctions. It also offers diplomatic support. We've seen how many times Mali votes on the side of Moscow over votes in the UN General Assembly on Ukraine. But there's a darker logic. A stable democratic Sahel would actually be beneficial to Europe's southern flank, because you would see a reduction of migration flows. Instability, therefore, ties down Western resources, attention, and money, much like we see with Russia's interference in the Balkans and their ability to simply destabilize. You don't have to stabilize, simply destabilizing is enough, but it comes at a cost. Russia fuels the chaos, but it also undermines its own credibility. African regimes may tolerate this for now because it's the best alternative, but they may also look elsewhere, such as we've seen with Turkey or the Gulf states increasingly inputting their opinions and resources into the Horn of Africa. So where does this go? Well, speculatively, there are a few possible futures. One, entrenchment under strain. What this means is Russia continues to pour resources into Africa core, even if it is overstretched. This means propping up the juntas with mercenaries and mining deals, but it risks, of course, bleeding Moscow's war economy and fueling deeper resentment from local populations who already see Russia increasingly as occupiers and no different to the West. Second, fragmentation of these alliances. Here, cracks inside juntas like the purges in Mali's officer corps, or even in the Moscow inner circle, can deepen. If soldiers resent Russian arrogance and brutality, coups within coups are possible. New leaders might try to balance away from Moscow, hedging between multiple external powers, or even returning westwards. Third, a hybrid chaos. Russia stays in Africa not as a destabilizer, but as a spoiler. A handful of mercenaries, heavy propaganda, constant ability to destabilize without ever building anything durable. This scenario fits Moscow's comfort zone. It can't deliver order, but it can make sure no one else does either. Perpetual instability, as we see in Bosnia, Kosovo, Moldova, etc. 4. Displacement by competitors. Here, Moscow's failures mount, and other actors simply step in. I've already mentioned Turkey or the Gulf states, as they are flooding resources, cash, and energy into Sudan, into Ethiopia. Even the United States, despite its baggage or the lack of interest with Donald Trump, as we've seen with his new peace deal between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, America can still leverage its power. Then there's China. While cautious, its financial muscle can step into the vacuum. And African leaders always know that they prefer transactional foreign policy, which you do get with China. Fifth, a slow fade. Finally, Russia may simply fade into irrelevance. With its forces overstretched in Ukraine, its inability to leverage its influence in the Caucasus, let alone in Africa, it simply cannot keep up with the likes of China, America, all countries that are simply more geographically closer, making it easier. Its Africa presence would shrink, therefore, to a rump force, symbolic, but strategically negligible, apart from perhaps a few Russian companies that aren't affected by sanctions existing in certain countries. The myth of Russia's unstoppable rise in Africa is just that, increasingly a myth. Wagner's brutality has given to Africa cause overstretch. Moscow dominates the information space, but on the battlefield, its weaknesses increasingly are showing. And if it can't follow through on its disinformation campaigns, then what's the point in claiming it can provide security? The sweating bear is overextended, and the question is no longer whether Russia can expand in Africa, but whether it can even sustain what it has, or if it's pushed out completely. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then do consider giving it a like and subscribing. My name is Pyotr. I am half Russian, half English, living in the West, but also growing and spending a fair amount of time in Africa, seeing firsthand the role of great power politics here. And if you appreciate what I'm trying to do here, then you can find links in the description to support me further, such as buying me a coffee. It's pretty cold here in Regent's Park, or by becoming a member or a patron. But with that, we'll see you in the next one. Take care.